Okay, so you're in the Holocaust in Film and Literature, German 59. I'm Professor Todd Presner, and welcome back to the winter quarter at UCLA. So I will basically have everything online for the class. Syllabus, course materials, projects, but also webcasts of lectures. Everything is available, well, everything except the readings is available online. This is a class that cuts across a number of disciplines: history, film, literature, but also kind of cultural studies, and even to a certain extent geography. Understanding the Holocaust is a very large and really quite ponderous undertaking, and it's not something that's easily done in a 10-week class. So there's a lot of, I think, quite honestly, there's a lot required of you, and quite honestly, the material that we'll cover is often difficult, and there's quite a bit of it. Okay, course description. What are we doing here? This is not a history class in a strict sense. A history class in a strict sense is something that I understand more along the lines of dates, chronologies, people, places, things that happened, the kind of the what happened, in a kind of objective sense. As much as we care about what happened, and I certainly do, because a lot of this class is about what happened, particularly between 1939 and 1945, most of it is not, it's not simply about what happened, but how do subsequent people later on represent what happened? How do they understand it from the perspective of having survived, or the perspective of maybe not having been a survivor, but trying to understand those events that unfolded primarily, certainly in Nazi Germany or Nazi-occupied Europe during the Second World War? How are those events understood by other generations, by film producers, directors, understood by novelists, understood by comic strip makers, understood by photojournalists? What kind of consequences do these events have for us in terms of ethical issues, in terms of issues around human rights? And also, how do we understand the Holocaust in a comparative perspective, meaning in reference to other genocides that preceded the Holocaust, but also other genocides that have happened after the Holocaust? And those are really interesting questions for us, because it takes the Holocaust out of a sort of almost a kind of sanctified historical space and begins to show that many of the issues around race and racism, many of the issues around anti-Semitism, or just hatred of a group of people, particularly with violent consequences, have had precedence throughout the 20th century prior to the Holocaust and continue to happen on a regular basis, extending all the way up to the 21st century today. And certainly the situation in Darfur is a perfect example of that, as well as the situation in Bosnia, the situation in Iraq, the situation in Cambodia in the 1970s, and all the way up to the first genocide of the 20th century, which happened in 1904, which most people have probably never heard of, in Southwest Africa, called the Herero genocide, perpetrated by German colonists against native Africans living in that area. About 65,000 people wiped off the face of the earth in a kind of systematic way that in some ways preceded, and significantly preceded, what happened in the 1940s. So one of the aspects of this class is certainly historical understanding. It's certainly comparative historical understanding, but it's also trying to use the lens of literature, film, and honestly, the subjective lens of memoirs and even poetry in order to understand a historical event. And so that's the difference between a history class and what we're doing. Certainly there's a basic historical knowledge that we need to understand and know, but much more is about the representation of that those complex historical events. Okay. So the class is split between probably people you've heard of and people you may not have heard of. Some of you may have read Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi before. Maybe you've heard of Hannah Arendt, a very important German Jewish philosopher. But I suspect that many of the other names on this list you haven't heard of, maybe with the exception of Spielberg. But Claude Lanzmann, a very important film director, Bernard Schlink, a novelist, Paul Celan and Nellie Sachs, poets, Ruth Kluger, a survivor who happens to live in Irvine, California, very interesting person who herself survived with her mother, Auschwitz. So many of these people will offer a diversity, a kind of panorama of perspectives on the Holocaust. And as a whole, I think the class has a kind of cumulative effect of trying to understand the complexity of this historical event. Alrighty, so I mentioned this site, ccle.ucla.edu. If you don't know it, please write it down because that's where you'll find the syllabus. Readings and things like that. Bookstores should have 5 books. The 5 books are all required. I think they're all available as used or new. You can also order them online, certainly. Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, Elie Wiesel's Night, Art Spiegelman's Mouse, Bernard Schlink's The Reader, and Samantha Power's A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. For class on Thursday, you'll have read the first 3 chapters from this book. This is Samantha Power's Pulitzer Prize-winning book on genocide. Really, I think all the books are certainly worth owning and having. I think for many different reasons, they should be part of your collection of books that you have throughout your life because of the message and the meaning of them. This book is different than the other ones because this is not a book written by a survivor, nor is it a book written by a son of a survivor, in the case of Spiegelman. Or Schlink, he's not a survivor, but somewhat has a different kind of vexed relationship to the Holocaust. But Samantha Power is a historian at Harvard. She studies human rights and the history of human rights abuses. And this is a book where she looks at the history of genocide in the 20th century and examines the American response to genocide, starting with the Armenian genocide in 1915, moving to the Holocaust in the 1940s, and then going comparatively through many other countries, including Cambodia, the genocide perpetrated by the Khmer Rouge, looking at Iraq, looking at Bosnia, and also Rwanda. And this is significant for our purposes here. We won't read every single page in this book, but one of the things that comes across here is, one, the persistence of racial and racist attitudes toward groups of people, particularly minorities, living within a country, and an orchestrated way in which some people in power basically figure out a way to extirpate this minority. Often based on racial justifications that are erroneous, or probably all of them are erroneous, but ones that are often used in a way to kind of create an allure or an illusion of something that was necessary. We had to save ourselves because otherwise they were going to get us. We had to get rid of them because otherwise they would undermine us. This kind of pretext is very common in the history of genocide. The other thing that she does, and I think this is particularly interesting for us as Americans, people who are more or less distant from the genocides we're talking about, we're distant temporally and geographically, right? I mean, Westwood is not exactly prone, I don't think at this exact moment in time, to a genocide. And it may strike you as kind of strange or funny, but most likely, there's no they rounding up a bunch of, say, Koreans, taking them off to concentration camps and gassing them. Now, you may say, maybe not today, but something similar did happen to at least Japanese. They weren't killed, at least in an exterminatory fashion, but they were sent to concentration camps here in California in the 1940s. And so we always ask about this issue about what's possible at a given time. Is it really possible to round up a group of people and ship them off somewhere? Is it really possible to round up all the Jews in Europe and push them out on trains into concentration and deportation camps and then kill them systematically? This seems completely absurd. Like, how could it be? How could it be that all of the Christians within the Ottoman Empire would be targeted, the Armenian Christians, by the Muslims in majority for extirpation? But 1 million were killed in 1915 very quickly, and they used trains to deport them, something that Hitler looked to as a precedent. So we begin to kind of ask these questions as you kind of go through the world in the next, if you're lucky, I'd say 60, 70, 80 years of life that you have. And we look at the kind of ways in which something like genocide and really kind of violent racism affects you. What's amazing about this book, what Powers does, is show the way that America not only generally knew about these genocides throughout the 20th century. We had reports, we knew what was going on, we were well aware, particularly with regard to the Holocaust, but the inaction, ultimately, of the United States to intervene for various reasons. Maybe fear, not wanting to take sides, not wanting to get involved in a national conflict. In the case of Rwanda, Bill Clinton saying as much. This is a national conflict between Hutus and Tutsis. We don't want to get involved, and yet by the end of the day, 90 days later, hundreds of thousands of people had been killed systematically. So at what point do we get involved? At what point does it actually begin to affect us? At what point is it relevant? How do we make that determination? And these are very profound and important questions that I think Powers is getting us to ask. So this book will kind of guide us through some of the historical, comparative aspects of the class. Okay, let's see, films. There's 5 films for the class. 2.5 are available on YouTube, I figured out. And in the past, we had the films available on a streaming format for people to watch in their dorm rooms. However, we can't do that anymore right now because UCLA apparently is being sued for copyright infringement, which I find completely flabbergasting, because I really believe that part of the educational mission of a university is fair use, and I also believe that the distribution of knowledge and the critical analysis of material, whether it's films or books or whatnot, when it's not being sold or pirated, is perfectly fair. However, we can't stream them to you in your dorm room anymore, but I managed to find a couple of them on YouTube, and others will be shown through, we'll do 2 probably film screenings outside of class, kind of en masse, where you can watch the films. They'll also be available in the library. And if you have Netflix, where you can download the films, you can download a streaming version of the film right there on your computer. It's easy enough to get them. They're not that obscure. The first film that we'll look at, which is actually for Thursday, is a Nazi propaganda film called The Eternal Jew. It was produced in 1940, shown throughout Nazi Germany. And as you can imagine, with a Nazi propaganda film, this is not a particularly sympathetic depiction of Jews. It's meant to demonize the Jewish population, and in some ways to galvanize support for Nazi racist policies. Basically, the Jews are always out to get the Germans. They're very sneaky. They're degenerate. They're racially inferior. They're nothing like Aryans, and Aryans are a superior race, and so forth. In many ways, it's a very simplistic, simplified. I mean, it's highly simplistic. It's almost sometimes comical. But nevertheless, the film was widely shown, although not always widely well received, in Nazi Germany, and does represent, I think, a condensation of a lot of anti-Semitic stereotypes that we need to come to terms with in order to understand the very fundamental question: why did the Nazis hate the Jews? Why? What was the problem here? And many of these questions are going to be unanswerable. That is to say, we won't have a final answer here that we can say, aha, now I understand. But rather, we'll see a condensation of many different stereotypes that have persisted for a very long time, in fact, that kind of come to a head during Nazi Germany. The other films, just briefly speak about them, a film called Conspiracy. This is a reenactment of the Wannsee Conference from 1942, which is often given as the historical kind of turning point in some ways, or turning point, I guess, in quotes, for the decision to come up and orchestrate and carry out the final solution, basically to carry out a genocide. This is a conference that took place outside of Berlin on January 20th, 1942. And the members that were there, the people that were there, basically conspired in some ways to carry it out. And Adolf Eichmann, a person you've probably heard of, was the person who was charged with not only dealing with transportation issues, but he took the minutes of the meeting, and the film is based on the minutes that he wrote down. We'll also look at the minutes of the meeting in the class. We'll look at Spielberg's Schindler's List, probably the most well-known Hollywood blockbuster film about the Holocaust, obviously about a single person named Oskar Schindler and his decision, and a kind of a significant soul-searching decision to save Jews. But the film is much more than just a story of Schindler himself. It's also, in some ways, a story about the Holocaust in a very large and, I think, profound sense. We'll screen this outside of class. I recommend actually watching it on a big screen. So we'll screen it here. You can watch it obviously on your computer, but I think a 15-inch monitor doesn't really do it justice, especially a film which is as visual and I think as large as this film is. So I would recommend actually watching it on a big screen if you're able to. Then Lanzmann's Shoah. Shoah is, I'm not going to ask you to watch the whole thing. It's actually 8 hours long. Now, if you're really interested in this topic, I highly recommend this film. In fact, I think it's probably the most important film that's ever been produced about the Holocaust. That sounds hyperbolic, but I really believe that to be the case. And the reason is that he spent nearly a decade and a half doing research, tracking down survivors, tracking down perpetrators, tracking down bystanders, and interviewing them about what they knew, what they saw, what they did, what they didn't do, and going back to the places where the Holocaust actually took place. Shoah, by the way, which I'll talk about the conceptual history of these terms in a minute, is a term, a Hebrew term that means destruction. And this is the term that he used to talk about what we now would call the Holocaust. Some of these excerpts are on YouTube. I've tagged them and given you the links where appropriate, but not all the parts that I want to show are on YouTube, and so we'll also have an outside screening. And finally, the last week of class, we'll look at other victims of Nazi genocide, non-Jewish victims. One of the things that's important, and unfortunately, I think this deserves really an entire class, although I'm not teaching it right now, is the fact that not only were Jews targeted for annihilation, but other groups were also targeted, although not with the same intents of complete annihilation off the face of the earth. Nazis targeted homosexuals, particularly gay men. They targeted lesbians, not for annihilation, but actually for rape, because they thought that they could create children for the Nazi state. They targeted gypsies, particularly the Sinti and Roma tribes. They targeted people with physical or mental handicaps, deafness, for example, or people who were disabled. They also targeted political opposition, particularly communists, and to a certain extent, even some religious dissidents, a number of priests who spoke out against the Nazi policy. So paragraph 175 is a film about gay victims of the Holocaust. And this will allow us, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the panorama of other victims and other victim groups in order to get a sense about the scope and the complexity of the Nazi genocide. And that happens in week 10. OK, so let's look at the syllabus real quick. Today, we will have a sort of a real lecture today. And we generally will go the full 75 minutes, only because, again, there's so much to do in the class, and there's really no time to take a break. I will talk a little bit about the terms Holocaust, genocide, and Shoah. We'll talk briefly about the history of anti-Semitism, which I'm going to take up again on Thursday when we look at the Eternal Jew. And we'll also look at a short poem today by a Hebrew poet named Dan Pagis called Written in Pencil in a Sealed Boxcar. So all that's coming up. OK, week 2, we'll look at two memoirs kind of side by side, Elie Wiesel's Night and Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz. Both these memoirs are written by survivors and very significant in terms of the way in which they're coming to terms with and writing about the experiences that they went through. Week 3 is imagining the final solution, that is from the perspective of the perpetrators. So week 2 is about the perspective of the victims. Week 3 is the perspective of the perpetrators. What did they think they were doing? What did they want to do? What were their goals? Who were they? Who were these people? And trying to understand the Nazis not just as, kind of crazy, lunatic thugs, but also trying to understand them also as very calculating, in some ways very smart, to some extent almost creative in terms of how to carry out and create a genocide of this scope and scale with this kind of efficiency. And also in many ways very everyday folks. In some ways what philosophers like Hannah Arendt calls very almost everyday, banal, fatherly-like people. People that could be your neighbors. So trying to understand this. And this is, I think, very important in the case of Eichmann and also in the case of a guy named Karl Hocker, who was an SS officer in Auschwitz. And he produced a little photo book, a really extraordinary photo book, in fact, documenting his time as an SS officer in Auschwitz. It's kind of like a vacation. Like, what did you do on your vacation between 1942 and 1945? These are photos that he took of his time in Auschwitz. And it's an extraordinary look into the everyday life of a Nazi official who, during the day, exterminated people, and at night, went out, so to speak, on the town, and also took vacations with his family. So trying to understand this dichotomy is really very fundamental to getting inside of the minds of the perpetrator, if that's even possible. Week 4, there's 1 week on poetry. I realize poetry always presents problems to people. As people always say, I am so bad at interpreting poems. We'll try to get better at interpreting poems. Poems are extraordinarily dense, kind of like crystals in a way, of entire events. And we'll spend a full week looking at some of the most significant poems and poets that have come out of the Holocaust, all written by survivors. Let's see, week 5 is about resistance and also acts of righteousness, particularly people who resisted Nazis, but also people who were non-Jewish victims who also spoke out, acted out, did things that put their own lives on the line and at risk, and sometimes in very extraordinary and inexplicable ways. So it also raises this kind of ethical question that I think it's always interesting to ask about yourself, to how far would you go to help someone else? At what point would you sacrifice your own life for something that you thought to be a tremendous injustice? So here's the midterm. So it's to be assigned, I guess, on February 4th, and it's due February 5th. Is that what I wrote? Yep, that's what I wrote. So that's what it is. So at the end of the 5 weeks, I'll post this midterm. You'll write it, you'll turn it in on Friday, and you'll learn more about this as time goes on. Then we'll do 2 weeks of films. We'll do Schindler's List in week 6, and we'll do Shoah in week 7. Both, I'll dedicate 4 lectures to these films because there's such an extraordinary amount of material that we have to cover. Some of the material I mentioned for Shoah is available on YouTube. And this is actually fascinating stuff. One of the most interesting interviews, and I'll just mention this now in case you want to look at it ahead of time, is an undercover interview that he does with an SS officer named Franz Suchamel, who was living in Berlin. He worked in Treblinka. And basically, he stood trial. He was acquitted, apparently, of having done anything wrong. And what Lanzmann does is go undercover with a concealed camera and interview this guy. And the 7 parts that he has in his film are all based on the interviews that he very surreptitiously, and you might even say illegally, collected from this person. He didn't get any kind of authorization or permission to publish them, but he did make them part of his film. And they're really some extraordinary testimony, and somewhat in an almost confessional sense as well, that he knew, that is, the SS officer knew and was involved in significantly more than ostensibly he let on. Week 8, we'll talk about trials, a number of genocide trials that have occurred, and also issues around talking about crimes against humanity and the problem of putting criminals on trial who are operatives of a state. This becomes a huge issue, and it's a current issue too, taken up at The Hague today, but it has been historically a big issue as to how to hold individuals responsible for collective action. Right? This becomes a huge question as to what the role of the individual agent was in carrying out something which obviously is much broader and bigger than what a single individual can do. I'm hoping that on the 25th we'll have 1 or more Holocaust survivors come to class as an opportunity to actually get firsthand testimony and hear from survivors. This date is still a little tentative, but I'm working on it. It may be a different date, so just if I have to change the syllabus to accommodate it, it'll be fine. I imagine it'll be that week. Week 9 is on what I call a transgenerational memory, which is one that goes across generations. And we'll look at a number of, a short novel, really interesting novel, and Ruth Kluger's memoirs, and a comic book written, created by a graphic artist named Art Spiegelman. graphic novel would be probably the more appropriate way to call it than comic book, but it is in the genre of a comic strip. Finally, the last 2 days will be the comparative aspect, and I realize this is not sufficient amount of time for this, but I think it's an important part of the class is to understand the panorama of victims and also policies that were created by the Nazis that targeted other groups, particularly Sinti and Roma, and gay and lesbian victims. So that's the class. That's where we're going. It's a lot of stuff. I would urge you not to miss any of the days. If you must miss a day, catch the webcast. It's very full. I only teach this class once a year at most, maybe more like every 2 years, because it's taxing. It's a difficult class because there's a lot of material, but honestly, it's a class that's interesting to me to teach because I always wonder at what point I become sort of callous towards the material. You know, I've read Elie Wiesel's Night probably, I don't know, a dozen times at most, maybe more. It's at what point do you kind of just begin to treat it sort of objectively, kind of distant? And what I'm always struck by is actually how emotionally wrought this text is and how much the material is. And I think if you are open to this material and you actually kind of are willing to almost move into the perspective of the author, and that also means both the victim and the perpetrator, I think that it's really quite an unsettling experience and potentially very profound. So I find this class, honestly, it's a lot of work, not only because of the amount of material, but it's a lot of work intellectually. And so I would just reserve some space for it. So first, the term Holocaust. The term Holocaust, interestingly enough, was not the term that the Nazis used to describe what they were doing. They didn't say we're going to have a Holocaust, we're going to orchestrate a Holocaust. And in fact, even after the period that we know to be where the Holocaust ended in 1945, the term didn't exist. In fact, the term that did exist was the term Shoah, which is a Hebrew term for destruction. And this is actually the most historically accurate term that the victims used to describe what was happening to them. Shoah simply means destruction. It's a term that was used primarily by Jews, Eastern European Jews, living in Poland in the early 1940s. And one of the things that you may know is that after Germany annexed Austria, Germany also expanded eastward and westward, expanded westward towards France in 1940, and expanded eastward towards Poland also 1939, 1940. And so what you have here is a kind of term that was created by the victims to talk about the systematic destruction of villages, pillaging, but also at this time, annihilation by gunshot, by groups of essentially traveling mobile killing units that went from town to town killing people. This is before people were actually sent to gas chambers, and it's also before people were systematically deported on trains. The first killing that took place was a much more haphazard killing, and it was done by traveling mobile units with machine guns, and they basically shot whole families and villages. The term that emerged was Shoah. What was happening was a Shoah. The term genocide was coined in 1944, actually by a Polish Jew who managed to escape, came to the United States, named Raphael Lemkin. And in Samantha Power's book, which you'll read for next time, you'll learn a little bit about Lemkin's history. And he coined the term, and it was a neologism. It was a word that hadn't been created before in order to understand something which didn't have a term prior to that. People talked about race murder. That was the closest that term that we had to describe the Armenian genocide in 1915, that there was a murder of a whole race. And this is interesting because this is taking murder to a different level. Usually when we talk about murder, we're thinking of one-to-one. There's one person killing someone else. Or maybe there's one person killing many people, but many people it's countable. Like I'm killing 10 people, 20 people. What does it mean to talk about killing of an entire race, right? This is a different level. So it means killing of hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. And no term existed for this because it hadn't happened in the history of humankind. Genocide or race murder is an invention of the 20th century. It's an invention of something more or less in our parents' or grandparents' lifetimes. And this is something which now we're completely capable of doing. It's an amazing thing to think that the human species has created this ability, but we've created the ability not only to annihilate the Earth, but also to annihilate groups of people en masse. This is something that happened first in 1904. I mentioned the Herero genocide in Southwest Africa, an area called, today it's Namibia. And this is by Germans, actually German colonists who colonized this area in the turn of the century and began having not only very racist ideas about how to deal with and treat and enslave the native population, but also began to try out experiments in race management at the beginning of the 20th century, experiments that absolutely influenced what the Nazis did about 3.5 decades later. So the term genocide is a term that comes into existence in 1944, coined in order to talk about, it breaks down: cide is to kill, genus is a type or species or group or ethnic, and the killing of a race as a new thing that needed a term to describe what was happening. And quite honestly, to describe the fact that it had happened 2 other times prior to the Holocaust. It had happened in Southwest Africa, and it had happened in the Armenian genocide under the Ottoman Empire. The term is introduced, in fact, to the UN in the 1945-46. It becomes part of the resolutions that the UN makes to talk about crimes against humanity, which is a term that comes specifically out of what we understand to be the Holocaust. We didn't talk about crimes against humanity prior to 1945. Today, we talk about crimes against humanity. The term Holocaust primarily gained usage in the United States in the 1950s. It's a term which has a strange etymology. Etymologically, it means a burnt offering or a sacrifice, almost like something that you give over as in a kind of sacrificial way. Now, it also means a kind of a slaughter. And in terms of how we understand the term today, it's primarily used to talk about the destruction of the Jewish communities in Europe by the Nazis. I think that most of the time when we talk about the Holocaust, we're meaning Jewish victims, Nazi perpetrators. We don't talk about a Holocaust against gay and lesbian victims simply because there was never an organized, orchestrated attempt to wipe gay and lesbians off the planet. Now, Nazis did target gay men and lesbians, same as they did with Gypsies, Sinti and Roma, political victims. But the reason the Holocaust is reserved, and I think this is probably important to realize, is because they did have a systematic attempt to kill and annihilate every single Jew from the face of the earth. That was their stated goal, and the attempt to carry it out. And so reserving that term to talk about the genocide against the Jews, I think is important. Second thing, what did the Nazis think they were doing? How did they describe what they were doing? They didn't use the term, obviously, Shoah or genocide or Holocaust. But they did have very specific terms that they used to describe what they were doing. The most important term that the Nazis used to describe what they were doing is a word called Vernichtung. It has the German word for nothing, N-I-C-H-T, nicht, in the middle of it. And it's a nominalization, which means to make into nothing, in the same way that annihilate, our term, means to make into nil, or nothing, to annihilate. Hitler used this term fairly widely. A number of other top-ranking Nazi officials also used the term, and particularly put it in the context of annihilating a race. In 1939, Hitler very famously declared that, he said, if the Jews force us, meaning the Germans, into war, it will result in the Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse Europas, the destruction or annihilation of the Jewish race of Europe. This is declared very widely at a very large rally. He mentioned it many times in his writing. And in fact, and it's interesting as well, that he made a comparative remark that there were other annihilations in history, most notably the Armenian annihilation, and he thought that in 1939, people had already forgotten that one. That he said, you know, who speaks about that today? We've forgotten of the Armenian Vernichtung. And in a sense, he's well aware that historically, something of this scope had already happened in another country against another group of people, right? That it already had happened. He makes that comparison, but also adds something else, that there's a kind of forgetfulness, a kind of lack of remembering, or a lack of caring. and he actually wants to build on that forgetfulness. The other terms that are used widely by the German Nazis this period, Ausrottung, meaning obliteration, to wipe out, and then probably most commonly in terms of everyday parlance by middle-ranking officials and others, Inlosung der Judenfrage. It's a kind of strange euphemism. It means the in solution or the final solution to the Jewish question. Juden is Jews. Why there would be a Jewish question in the first place is interesting, like how you come up with a final solution to a question about an ethnic or religious or minority living within your majority. But they would speak often of a final solution, what to finally do. And the final solution in this case was connected to the Wannsee Conference, where they decided that they were going to kill all the Jews. So that's the term that's used there. Later, the term Völkermord is used, the murder of a people or a group or an ethnicity, but that's not a term that was widely used at the time. But that's a term that has some parlance today. The term Holocaust, honestly, has been adopted in German everyday language, and so Holocaust is a term, although originating in the United States in the 1950s, is a term that also describes, at least in contemporary Germany, what happened. So we'll see these terms come up. I think it's important to understand them because we're always going to be moving between the perspective of the perpetrators, perspectives of the victims. I'm going to talk about this very briefly. I realize that's a tiny bit small. Maybe I can just make this bigger for a second. I'll talk about the origins of anti-Semitism more on Thursday, but this is basically just a tiny preview, in a kind of reductive way, in fact, of why hate the Jews. Anti-Semitism essentially just means, at least in contemporary parlance, hatred of Jews. Where did it come from? Was it something that originated with the Nazis? Did they invent it? The answer here is absolutely not. It's something that had really a millennial-long history in Europe, and in many ways was not even strictly at its height in Germany until the 1930s. Other countries, particularly France and Austro-Hungary, were probably considered more anti-Semitic at different points in time in the early 20th century. So there's different reasons that have been given for anti-Semitism. This is very reductive and simplistic, but nevertheless, I think will give you some at least some orientation point for understanding the stereotypes in the Eternal Jew film. There are religious reasons for hating Jews. There's linguistic, ethnic reasons. There's national political reasons. There's racial reasons. And there's economic reasons. Religious reasons, probably the most basic, is the idea that, and this is completely erroneous, but the idea that Jews killed Christ. Romans killed Christ. But a sense that they have a collective guilt that transcends generations, and therefore, because they don't recognize Christ as a savior, they're not saved, and essentially, unless they become baptized and recognize Christ as a salvific figure, then the Jews, they essentially will not be saved. And this stereotype and this problematic is obviously deeply rooted in Christianity, and particularly a stereotype that gained a lot of cogency in the medieval period and later. So this is hundreds of years old. Linguistic or ethnic reasons are probably a little bit more palatable in the sense that Jews are separatist. That is, they speak, at least Jews in this period, Hebrew or Yiddish. They don't know a national language. They're not assimilated. They have different schooling, different dress. They look different skin color, different hair, different modes of worship. National or political reasons, meaning they're not citizens of the host country that they're living in. They've come there because they're tribes, they're wandering, they've been forced out of different nations. They've moved about. They don't dwell as citizens of the nation, but are a foreign element. They're sometimes tolerated, but often expelled. And this happens throughout the medieval and modern period. Later, they're considered to be, in the film, very sneaky because they behave like Germans, like they look almost too German. And so it's sort of like the opposite problem. Racial explanations become very important in the 19th century. Race science is something that's invented in the 1850s in Europe and also comes to the United States. Basically, hierarchies of races. What race is the most superior and the most advanced? Turns out it's always European and Aryan and white. And what race is at the bottom? Often African and often Jews. And somewhere in the middle are these quote-unquote Orientals. Now, this is completely bogus and completely silly, right? But it becomes very compelling for Europeans at this time doing anthropological and biological work, trying to figure out which races are most advanced and superior and which ones are not. And often the idea is that there's some kind of determinacy based on blood and later genes that determines your destiny. These explanations, completely bogus, but nevertheless completely compelling to people in this period. Economic reasons. Perhaps the most persistent stereotype of anti-Semitism is the Jews and money, right? The idea they go together. Jews run the banks and that they control money. The reason that this stereotype exists is actually because of a Christian doctrine formulated by Thomas Aquinas that forbid Christians from lending money. In fact, one of the things that happens in the 16th, 17th, 18th century is that Jews are forbidden from many different areas of work, like manufacturing, trade, and commercial, actually the making of commercial things. They're forbidden from working in guilds. And what happens is that one of the areas they are allowed to deal with is money and money lending. And this means that for kind of real reasons, Jews become associated with money, but also because they're not allowed to engage in other practices like manufacturing that Christians are allowed to. This is extremely common in German-speaking areas, but it's more broad than that. It's probably as broad as most of Central Europe. Other stereotypes that you have throughout history: Jews caused the bubonic plague in the 14th century. Jews are always wandering. They don't have a homeland. Jews haven't been redeemed or saved. Jews practice ritual murder. They kill Christian children for religious ceremonies. No evidence of this, but yet these stereotypes persist and exist and are sort of all the basis of a kind of boiling anti-Semitism that in the 20th century comes to a head really through new racial and kind of very racist ideas about the nation state. And so the Germany under the Nazis is the preeminent or the racial state par excellence. And the idea is Germany will be strong if its people are strong. Its people are strong only if they're cleansed of the impure elements. Who represents the most impure? The Jews. We need to cleanse Germany of Jews. That sounds very like a syllogism, like almost like a reductive syllogism, but I think that's probably an accurate depiction of what Nazi ideology is based upon. Okay, so I realize that's a lot. I think that you needed to know a little bit about this if this is new, because you're going to watch the Eternal Jew film and you're like, where did all this come from? Like, what are all these like stereotypes and thoughts about Jews? Well, there's a bunch of them, and then you'll sort of see how these play out in the film. All right, good. I have 10 minutes left, which is super, and I'm going to have to use it. This is really interesting. This is a poem, and it's a short poem, but it's perhaps one of the most compelling and difficult poems I've ever come across with regard to the Holocaust. It's by a Jew who escaped Bukovina, which is an area around Romania and Russia today. He wrote this poem in 1970. So it wasn't literally found in a sealed boxcar. It was written in 1970. But the poem is called Written in Pencil in a Sealed Boxcar. And it just goes like this. Here in this transport, I, Eve, with Abel my son. If you see my older son, Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I... And that's it. It ends there. So written in pencil in a sealed boxcar. Here in this transport, I, Eve, with Abel my son. If you see my older son, Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I... something. So, you've met these people before. Eve, Abel, Adam, Cain, right? You've seen them before. right? This is the foundational story in some ways of Judeo-Christian, the Hebrew Bible of that tradition. These are the first four people on earth, Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. But something happens to these people, right? Obviously, in this poem, they're put in a very different place. They're no longer in the Garden of Eden. They're put in a railway car. They're put in a transport. They're in a sealed boxcar, right? So he's taking these biblical figures and transporting them somewhere else. Here in this transport, I, Eve, with Abel, my son. If you see my older son, Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I... something. Why in the world is this poet taking these biblical figures and putting them in a boxcar? That's our question. Now is the part where someone volunteers. What's going on?
Because Cain betrayed Abel back in the Bible story. And so it's kind of like Cain's gone, and it's kind of like the people who left and the people that Cain was cursed because of.
Right, so in the Bible story, what happens? Cain kills Abel, right? You might remember Abel existed for 6 lines in the Bible. He existed in chapter 4, lines 2 through 8. It's a very short lifetime to have, but that's his lifetime, very, very short. He was killed by Cain. But in this poem, he's there. He's alive, right? He's there with Eve in a transport car. So he's not dead yet. Here in this transport, I, Eve, with Abel, my son, right? Abel's there. He's not dead. If you see my older son, Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I... So Cain's away somewhere, right? But he's not there. Adam's not there either. So it's basically a mother with a child, right? It's Eve with Abel. It's a mother with a child. There's apparently a father and a son somewhere else. They're not together. They've been separated. Maybe separated because, on transports like this, what often happened were that families were separated. The families went different ways. Mothers and daughters, sons and fathers often got separated. But still, why these biblical figures? What else? There was someone else over there. Hmm? So it's kind of like an updated story of the Bible. It's almost like imagine taking the fundamental creation story that's the basis of Judeo-Christian belief and putting it in the Holocaust. Like taking that story and basically transporting it out of the safety and the beauty and the sanctity of the Garden of Eden and putting it in a deportation train. What would happen to that story? Like how would we see humankind? And it's interesting because not only is that story certainly sanctified and the very first story of a family, it's also the first murder, right? Cain commits the first murder in the history of humankind. The population of the world just went down 25%. I mean, it sounds funny, but it's true, right? If you take the story literally, that's what happened. You just killed 1/4 of the world at that point. Interesting, but this story is before that murder takes place because Abel's still there. So who is the you? Who is this poem addressed to? Here in this transport, I, Eve, with Abel, my son, if you see my older son, Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I. Who is the you?
Whoever finds it.
Interesting. Whoever finds it. Meaning whoever sees it, because it's written in a pencil in a sealed boxcar. Like it's almost like it's an inscription inside of a car. So who finds this? Who? But not only, maybe you're right, whoever finds it, but you have this obligation, right? You not only have to read it, but you have to tell him, meaning Adam, something. What are you supposed to tell Adam? If you see my older son, Cain, what do you have to tell? If you see my older son, you, Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I. What are you going to tell Cain, exactly? What are you supposed to tell? I don't know. Maybe it wraps around. Tell him that I am here in this transport, I, Eve, with Abel, my son. If you see my older son, Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I am here in this transport, I, Eve, with Abel, my son. If you see my older son, Cain, son of Adam, a kind of vicious circleness in a sense that tell him that I am here. Tell him that I miss you. Tell him that I have something to say. Tell him that this has happened to me. Tell him that I'm in this boxcar. I mean, who knows, right? But it's astounding that we simply are left in the sense of being cut off, right? The poem ends without us knowing what you're supposed to tell, right? It's a kind of a sense of almost like without closure, right? You want to know, tell him what? Tell him that I'm here, but what am I supposed to convey? And
Isn't that kind of the struggle in general with teaching about the Holocaust, is that you really can't say it in words, that it's not something that you can really formulate, that it's more, it could never be actually experienced.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's what is kind of going, that you can't really say because there's a million things, but there's nothing really to say at the same time.
That's interesting. I mean, I often start off with this poem because in many ways I agree with that. I mean, there's a million things you could say, and at the end of the day, you will have studied for 10 weeks and you will have read all this stuff, and you probably still won't understand or know why. I mean, at the end of the day, I could study this my entire lifetime and learn as much as I can, but I'm ultimately not going to finally be satisfied or say, aha, I now understand why. It's an extraordinary sense of, and not only that, there are people who can never speak or tell what they went through because they were killed, right? I mean, essentially, Eve and Abel are probably on their way to be deported, and probably this is essentially a last voice that they have if we're going to take seriously what this is about. Any thoughts? There was someone else over there?
I was just wondering, how do we know that this is specifically about the Holocaust?
Ultimately, we don't. Ultimately, we don't. I mean, it could be, there's probably a good amount of evidence that kind of bespeaks an experience that was very common during the Holocaust, meaning being deported, being separated from families, being put in a train, being sent somewhere, and wanting to convey a message or information to others. But we don't know, it's not a Holocaust poem per se. So let me end by showing you some real letters. These are actual letters that people wrote in 1942 that were thrown from trains going to Auschwitz. These are real historical documents. These letters were found by people in towns where these letters were recovered. They often didn't go to their actual people that they were sent to. Please toss this note in the nearest mailbox. It's now morning. We're in the railroad car, like here in this railroad car, with the whole family. We're leaving with the last transport. Plonsk is cleansed of Jews. Please go to the Bam family on 6 Niski and send them regards. Yours truly. This is one from Warsaw, December 16, 1942, to a family in the Warsaw ghetto. Please kindly toss this note into a box. I'm in the Praga station. I'm in a railway station, writing a few words to you. It's unknown where we are traveling. Be well, Leah. Here's another one, December 17, 1942. My dears, we're now passing Czestochowa. Therefore, I'm writing a few words. We have passed Warsaw also. We are traveling to work. Think positively. I'm giving you my new address because you don't have it. I don't have it yet. Parting kisses, yours, Gittel. These are astounding. I mean, these are almost incomprehensible that you could be in a railway car, deported with your family, scrawling a postcard. You don't have access to stamps. You don't have access to actually conveying these letters. You drop it out of a window. These happen to have been found by people. They're preserved. They're part of an archive that Yad Vashem has of letters from the Holocaust. It's one of the things that I'm particularly interested in studying. But in many ways, this you is completely unclear. This you goes back to like you, me, you, any of us. Like, who are these letters to? Ultimately, it becomes up to us if we read them or, we want to access them.